Hello and welcome to Naturalist Gaming. My name is Dean, and I'm going to be with you for these game streams, starting with Walden, a game, and focusing on a whole series of games that are environmentally themed, that either feature nature prominently, ecology, the environment, in a very specific way that we're going to talk about. The first thing I want to do is just kind of explain what the criteria for this channel are, what kind of games I'll be playing, and why those specific ones. So the idea for this side project um, came from a couple places. One, the fact that there is, I believe, a cross-section of people who are both interested in the natural environment, they're nature geeks or hiking geeks or whatever, and people who play games. Games are such a huge part of culture these days, and there's inevitably some big crossover between people who love getting outdoors and also love sitting at a computer and playing a game. And the main inspiration came from reading a book from 2019 called Playing Nature by Alenda Chang. It's a fantastic book. And in the book, she gives a few ideas that have kind of stuck with me. One of those is she re-envisions what a game walkthrough might be, right? So for anyone who's a gamer, you get stuck in a game, you go to YouTube, you find a video walkthrough of a game to help you get unstuck, or you watch someone streaming a game online to help you get acquainted with the game, or because you enjoy the commentary of the creator or whatever. And one of the things Alenda challenges us to do in her book is to rethink walkthroughs, almost in a literal sense. What would it be like if we walked through a game with someone whose company we enjoyed? Someone like a naturalist who has a lot of knowledge about the natural world and can share and explore those things with us. This is a different way of playing games. It's obviously not for everyone. It's not high octane, big energy kind of gaming, but it is, it will ask you to slow down and to think more carefully, to stop and notice features of a game that you would otherwise just run past. Walden is a great game to start with, a great example of that, but I'm excited to also talk about other games that are out there, games that are mostly new and emerging, because I think this is an approach that has only slowly started to become important to game developers, game designers, but I think that in the near future, we're going to be seeing a lot more of this kind of thing. So what would it be like to go through video games, um, walking through them with a naturalist, or at least in this case, since I'm not an expert, a nature enthusiast, somebody who will enjoy learning along with you as you explore the natural world in games, learning the name of the species, thinking about ecological issues, and so on, right? It may seem like a strange medium, video games, but as I said, organizations around the world are starting to team up and think about how the power of games, and by power of games, I mean the sheer number of people who play games and the amount of time that people devote to playing games, how that power can be harnessed in order to help the environment, or at least to help us start thinking more critically about the environment. Why not just go outside and take a walk instead of playing video games, right? That's going to be an obvious criticism. And Alenda Chang has another interesting point in Playing Nature, where she says that games are basically a kind of mesocosm, a small exploratory space where people can learn about nature without being too overwhelmed, right? Especially for those who are just starting out trying to learn things, the sheer amount of information can be overwhelming, right? And it's nice to have a little like smaller lab space where you can learn things at a slower pace, in an isolated environment, right? And it's also good for those who are like completionists, right? If you are learning the names of things and you feel just overwhelmed because you really want to learn everything there is to learn, nature is going to overwhelm you very easily, right? But you can learn the name of all the species you encounter much more simply in a game like Walden. So it's great because there's that feeling of, gamifying it just enough to satisfy, right? The feeling of accomplishment that you've really learned something. But then you can take those skills and transfer them to the real world. So as I said, I'm going to be starting this series of videos off with the game Walden by USC Games, and I hope to continue with a series of other games. But the very last thing I want to talk about before we start our playthrough is a starting definition for what an environmental game is actually going to look like. And for this definition, just like Alenda Chang does in her book, I'm going to turn to Lawrence Buell. Lawrence Buell's book, The Environmental Imagination. So in the book, Environmental Imagination, Lawrence Buell gives kind of a 4-point definition for understanding what we might consider a literary text about the environment. The first criteria that he lists is the non-human environment is present not merely as a framing device, but as a presence that begins to suggest that human history is implicated in natural history. Okay, so when we think about how this applies to games, most of the games that feature nature, the natural world, something resembling, Earth's environment, natural environments, usually they're the background, right? If we interact with them at all, we usually interact with them in kind of irresponsible ways, right? We extract resources from them without consequences. We, utilize animals in ways that don't treat them with the dignity of, being an individual separate from us, but sort of, like they are our property, right? There's lots of ways of interacting with the environment that are either harmful ideas related to the environment, or there's lots of games that just present the environment as backdrop, right? So an environmental game would present the environment not just as a framing device, not just as the background, but a presence, and would remind us that our history is implicated in the natural history around us. So that's the first criteria. The second criteria is that the human interest is not understood to be the only legitimate interest. Okay, so once again, we might care about the well-being of a fox in a video game, right? We might care about the life and well-being of a tree, or the environment around us is a character. It becomes something that has its own interests apart from just the humans. And this can be difficult because human interest is often what drives the narrative of a good game, right? But there are alternative and experimental games, especially coming from indie studios, that challenge this kind of norm. The third criteria that Buell gives us is human accountability to the environment is part of the text's ethical orientation, right? And accountability to the environment can come in, lots of different ways. But for example, if we were to play a survival game or a game where we interact with the environment and draw resources from it, does that game reinforce the idea of ethical behavior towards the environment by, for example, limiting the amount of resources that you can take? If you take too many resources, there's some sort of disadvantage for the player. There's some sort of reminder that there are not unlimited potential resources to be tapped, etc. There is some sort of ethical orientation in the game towards the environment around us. And the final criteria is some sense of the environment as a process rather than as a constant or a given is at least implicit in the text, in this case in the game, right? So the environment is not just something that's static, that stays the same, that is constant and unchanging, but like the real natural world around us is constantly in flux and is changing, right? One of the ways we'll be able to see this in the game Walden is the progression of the seasons. We'll be staying in the woods around, the Walden Pond in Concord, and seeing the progression of the seasons. We start there in midsummer, and we progress into the fall, into the winter, and then into the following spring, and we can even continue to stay there beyond the end of the actual year that the game presents. So what is Walden a game? Well, one of the most unlikely video games that you'll ever play that's on the market right now, at least. Walden is based on the book written by Henry David Thoreau. He famously moved to Walden Pond, about a mile outside the town of Concord, in 1845, and he lived there for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, and wrote a book about his time there. He built a cabin in the woods, and though he wasn't quite as antisocial and hermity as people think that he is today. He made lots of visits to the town. He visited his family. He visited his friends, and friends came to visit him often in the cabin. One of his main concerns was trying to look at the natural world around him with fresh eyes, and also rethinking, lots of social, political, economic issues for himself and for the people that he was writing for. Some of those issues involved, for example, rethinking how many material goods we really need to be happy or to be satisfied, right? So how do you turn all these philosophical ideas and all this observation of nature and this kind of life in the woods into a video game? Well, Tracy Fullerton and the team at USC Games took on that challenge. It was a 10-year development project, and they created this indie game called Walden, a game. And it is my favorite game of all time because I am a giant nut of, big fan of Henry Thoreau's. I've made a couple visits to Walden Pond myself. I've read and reread, Walden, and am working my way through the many volumes of his journal, which, spanned almost his whole adult life. And I have an entire bookcase of books about Henry Thoreau, so he's always been kind of one of my biggest inspirations. Somebody that I love coming back to all the time for interesting thoughts to get inspired by. So when a video game was created, it was the first time that I realized that video games have the potential to cross between our lives as gamers and our lives as environmentalists, or in some cases, literary scholars. So I'm looking forward to playing Walden the game. The way this is going to work, I'm going to stream these videos of the playthroughs, and you are going to have to practice some patience if you come along on this journey. One of the things you can do with these videos is kind of like skip to the parts that are interesting to you and get inspired for your own playthroughs, or skip to particular species or areas of the pond that are interesting to you. Maybe see things in this playthrough that you missed in your own. But I also encourage you, of course, to go and play the game yourself, right? Don't just depend on my playthrough, because what's so interesting about Walden in particular is that every playthrough is somewhat unique. Some of the elements of the game will be similar between your playthrough and mine, but the order in which you approach these things and whether you skip some things or do some things is all going to be different. One of the really cool things about Walden that I love is that in the original conception, Tracy Fullerton really wanted to let you create your own version of the book. And the way that was going to work is, as you move through the game, everything you look at around you is going to give you some passage of the book Walden. Whether that is, Henry Thoreau reading a passage to you when you find an arrowhead on the ground, or when you look at, for example, a tree or an animal, and a passage from the book related to that pops up as you zoom in on that particular organism. And as each passage of the book pops up like this, it appears in your journal, and then you can browse through your journal and reread them at will. For the PC version of the game, actually, a fan of the game actually created a journal extractor. So at the end, you can pull all of the text out of the book and have your own, journal of Walden. But the original idea for the game was actually do that for every player, and you'd be able to send in your version of the book Walden that you had created, which would be in a totally unique order depending on how you approached the world. And then you could have the book bound and sent to you. So you could have your own kind of remixed version of Walden. Each and every player would have their own, which is such a fun idea. So you can think of Walden the game in some ways as kind of Walden remixed, right? Of course, still go to the original book, read it, enjoy it, and then, especially after you've read it or after you've visited Walden Pond and Concord, to come to this game brings even more. It's even more rich that way, right? You'll see even more things that you haven't seen before, and it's really fun too to even just walk around the pond now. And there's this weird mix in my mind between memories of having been to Walden Pond and the game's environment. And the Walden that lives in my mind is some strange amalgam of the two. So, anyways, without any more further ado, thanks for being patient and bearing with me. We're going to kick off our playthrough of Walden.